I always have guests introduce themselves. Will you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Nyle DiMarco. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm deaf. I'm an actor, an advocate, kind of all of the above.
Yeah, I guess you are all of the above. You currently have like 9 projects. I got an email about what you're up to. It's very long.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, I'm definitely wearing a lot of hats these days, you know? I'm having a great time playing around. It's funny, just 5 years ago, I would have never imagined being in the position that I am. But honestly, I'm so more than happy to shoulder it and to be able to develop, you know, projects and content and TV shows about deaf people. It's great.
Right. I think that's part of what I wanted to ask you about is that I first became aware of you on America's Next Top Model.
Right.
Where I know that, I mean, obviously being deaf impacts working on that show, but also to be a model is maybe something where, well, I don't know the experience. You know, how much is this new role that is sort of more focused on like a sort of mental expression versus like a physical expression? And this is just, I'm not a model. This is just my vague understanding of modeling. But it does seem like you've shifted in terms of your focus.
Absolutely. Quite a big shift. But really what happened was America's Next Top Model, you know, came to me and I really thought it was going to be kind of a one-time thing. I really was planning on going back and teaching math, which was my original career goal. But it became pretty apparent early on, and I will admit, before that, I had never watched America's Next Top Model. So I didn't really realize how big of a show it truly was. But after the America's Next Top Model experience, I was like, oh shit, there's no way for me to go back. It was just straightforward into the industry. And, you know, that transition happened really quickly for modeling. You know, and of course I was thrilled. You know, I would do a few really great jobs through the year and I enjoyed it, but I also felt very limited and I didn't really feel so connected with the work. You know, as much as how people see deaf people in the world, I realized with this platform, it was really key for me to use it and to leverage it, you know, to the deaf community's advantage and to really try to reframe the deaf community in sort of the hearing limelight. And yeah, that's where the transition started.
Well, I can't remember then, prior to being on that show, I can't remember if, well, also it's a reality show, so whoever knows what's going on. But prior to being on the show, were you working in the modeling industry?
I do get asked that a lot. During college, a lot of people had reached out to me and, you know, new photographers or people had just kind of reached out and said modeling could be something that could really fit you. And I didn't really understand what the business or the industry looked like. I actually didn't know that there were modeling agencies and, you know, that certain models were represented. I just didn't really know. I was going to school in DC at the time. And obviously DC is not quite a fashion capital by any means. But I never really realized what the pursuit sort of would entail. And then after college, when people were telling me that I absolutely had to give it a shot. I mean, I played around with a few test shoots and some of my friends who were photographers, but, you know, America's Next Top Model really was the biggest impact when the casting director reached out to me on Instagram. I mean, you know, they said, hey, we think you should try out for this show. We think you'd be a really good fit. The first time I saw it, I was like, that's definitely a scam. But turns out it wasn't. I mean, they were really interested in seeing me on the show, and I guess the rest is history. But you know, point being, you know, I was very inexperienced before coming into the show. Yeah.
Well, and I want to ask about that because I know you went to Gallaudet University, which is a university that's for deaf or hard of hearing people. I also know that it's a university where there are 2 languages, English, but ASL is also an official language on campus.
Yeah, definitely. You know, Gallaudet's campus itself is a bilingual campus in every respect. Yes. Absolutely. But on campus, we use American Sign Language as our first language. And that's really kind of the culture that's taught, you know, written English and read English. Of course, we use just the same. Yeah. So it definitely is a bilingual campus for sure. And the college is for deaf and hard of students. Or deaf and hard of hearing students, of course. But there is a percentage of hearing students who are able to get in to the college. And it just really depends on the requirements of knowing ASL.
Got it. and then you personally are also from a family where you're part of, are you fourth generation? Is that what I read?
I am. Yeah, I'm fourth generation. Yeah. Yeah, we've got a big deaf family. It's funny, a lot of people actually think that, it was a really unfortunate experience, and fourth generation deaf must mean that I really had to struggle, through all these horrible, oppressive times. But it actually really works in our favor. It's very comparative to hearing kids with hearing parents, right? I mean, there are many deaf kids out there who, come to, deaf kids who come to hearing parents and definitely struggle with communication at home. But for me, I had access to language and, communication. I mean, my whole family was deaf, so it was really a celebration. They already knew what to do. I was, immediately enrolled in a deaf school and picked up sign as my first language. And yeah, I mean, that really was my childhood and my whole world. So many people really are shocked to hear that it's, utopia for me.
Do you have siblings?
I do. So I have two brothers. If you can believe this, I'm actually a twin.
Right.
But funny enough, he doesn't look anything like me. He's got red hair, fair skin, freckles. A lot of people think that we're just best friends. They don't actually recognize us as twins. But yeah, both of my brothers are deaf as well.
So I'm imagining then that, well, what was it like interacting? It's your family and then the rest of the world who, by and large, does not sign, is not fluent in ASL. And I would imagine that might be equivalent to like some immigrant experiences where you move into an area where there aren't other folks, but you're not arriving.
Right, definitely.
Here. You're just, and there's also the lineage of being the fourth generation family. And certainly that is equivalent, like I said, in other languages. There are other people who are, fourth generation Americans, and they speak primarily with their family one language and then a language outside. But what was that like for you in terms of inside the family and then the sort of system or climate around you?
Sure. Very similar to the immigrant experience. I often use that as an anecdote. Look at me like a foreigner, right? And that American Sign Language is just a different way to communicate, right? Lucky for me, growing up in a family where I was the fourth generation, all Sicilian New Yorkers, and luckily in New York, everyone uses their hands. I mean, gesture is such a part of kind of who we are as New Yorkers. My mother actually, went to a deaf school. So she came out with a lot of experiences, in the hearing community. And, my mother often would go to Studio 54 in New York, actually. She is a big dancer, used to go there all the time, and is very, very, very good with interacting with hearing people. So when we were kids, of course, my mom was, very much sort of that bridge, right? She kind of, taught us how to, work and interact with hearing people. My mom always really pushed her kids to play on hearing leagues, to play sports. And, when of course we would always ask, like, why are we playing with these hearing kids? She'd say, well, at some point you have to learn how to interact with them. And now looking back at that experience, I'm incredibly grateful for what that gave me, right? I never really felt a big difference, between hearing people and deaf people. I really more or less felt that hearing people just spoke a different language. They were kind of a foreigner. I was kind of a foreigner. All of our close friends in the neighborhood were all hearing. So it really was an interesting experience, certainly. And that, of course, contributed to my experience on America's Next Top Model. And now with my career in the industry, 90% of the people that I work with live in the hearing world. So, for the first 25 years of my life, things were, very different, but of course really impacted that. I'm so thankful, but I definitely wasn't sheltered by any means.
Well, sports, that makes so much sense. I mean, it's a great idea, especially because, literally baseball has signs. What sports did you play?
Yeah, absolutely. To be honest with you, I played just about everything I could. Baseball, there's actually a really interesting history, dating back to, the sign for strike, or, to ball, or, to all the different gestures. And those were actually created years ago by a deaf baseball player. His name was Dummy Hoy. And he was the first deaf baseball player who ever made it professional in the 1800s. And when he got into the pro leagues, he couldn't communicate with people. And so they developed essentially a system of hand signs or hand signals. And the rest is history. Now we see that, those hand signals have made it to all sorts of other sports. That's how we communicate across fields. And all because of a deaf person.
Well, I was also reading that Gallaudet is where the football huddle originated.
Yeah.
because folks were signing and needed, just for anybody listening that doesn't know,
definitely,
like that,
definitely.
that
Didn't want anybody to be able to see
folks
them.
were signing and they didn't want people to see the signs.
Right. Yeah. Against playing, against another deaf football team. Obviously, if you're communicating in sign language across the football field, you can see, across the football field, you can see exactly what the other team is planning for. So that's where the huddle was invented. And I don't know why hearing people thought it was a great idea, but I guess they really love it. Now you see it on TV every Sunday.
Right. I think it. Maybe it also just is that thing of, feeling protective and like you're part of a group, which again which makes so much sense why your mom would suggest that. Like it makes perfect sense. And I also am curious now that I'm like realizing, because I just said the word listening. Do you interact with podcasts, you personally, as a human?
To be honest with you, it's kind of another thing. So podcasts are typically just done through spoken English and with voice. A lot of them do provide transcripts, which are pretty extensive. And, occasionally I'm happy to pull one up and give it a read through, but it's not the same experience as it would be, to listening to a conversation. If there were podcasts with, say, sign interpreting or, something that I could essentially listen to through my eyes, I think I'd be a lot more comfortable and I might even be a fan. But yeah, I'll take it anyway. But, to be honest with you, I don't have any favorite podcasts that really come to mind.
That makes perfect sense. I will say I do not think it is an art that is accessible. Like, I just don't think that it's something that folks are focused on making it accessible for deaf or hard of hearing folks. And I will even say as a comic,
right.
A lot of times when I've provided an ASL interpreter, which I've done many times, it usually comes per a request, which again is something that like I could continue to work on. But it is the onus is on the deaf or hard of hearing person to send me some random tweet or to get in touch through my management or whoever's booking the show. And that has happened many times. But like, what a fucking bummer to have to constantly work to be accommodated.
Right. Definitely. It's always a matter of reaching out, but it's just so become a part of what it is. We oftentimes wish accessibility would just come to us. It's funny, actually for, Trump's, large meetings and for his large rallies, he doesn't provide interpreters. And so a group actually sued the White House and finally, they are putting access and transcripts up live.
Wow.
Took a lawsuit.
And that makes so much sense too, that it would be important to read what he's saying, specifically that person, versus being able to see what he's saying, comprehend what he's saying in a visual format. Like that is it's just so impactful. His presence is so impactful in a negative way, but it's part of it.
Definitely. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Honestly, he, downplayed the whole thing, right? And continued to, deprive millions and millions of deaf Americans, of their access to participate in the democratic system and to vote. It's just wild.
Do you think is there any art form or like who's doing a good job with this? Is there anybody doing a good job making things accessible for you?
Like just in general? Let me think.
Yeah. Now that because I guess now that you're saying it, I'm like,
question.
This feels like it would always be on you, like I can't think of something. And I thought maybe you had that like magic thing. You're like, this person's nailing it.
Same. Yeah. It is definitely a constant, it's constantly a lack of access. But yeah, I can't think of anyone specifically.
Wow. I will, my partner is, she has an autoimmune disease that affects her energy level and affects her ability to get around. She also, and she can use, sometimes she uses walking sticks like as a as an aid. But the particular ones that she uses, they're hiking sticks. So I think it can look like
Right.
other stuff's going on.
Right.
Like,
Right.
and then she also visually, you know, she's one of those people who doesn't necessarily look like she's dealing with something.
Right.
And it's been really eye-opening being with her,
Very
traveling
common.
with her.
That's so much a part of our general community, you know, of disability is, you know, really just an invisible disability. Definitely.
Yeah,
All under the
absolutely.
umbrella.
Right. I mean, like, for instance, we board planes first. I mean, in a time when we would fly, we're not flying now, but in a time that we would fly, the section where they ask who would like to board planes first, like, we go up at that time. She actually does need
Right.
extra time to get on, but we look like two able-bodied people in our 30s, and sometimes she'll be in a wheelchair to get on, and sometimes she won't. And it is like we were going through customs traveling internationally, and had been waiting for so long.
It's funny that you mentioned that. There's so many invisible disabilities, right? There's visible, and of course there's invisible disabilities. And it's like you mentioned, right? You look like two normal able-bodied people in their 30s. I mean, you know, people look at me and they have no idea, right? They don't know until they try to communicate with me. The same thing with your partner. There's a lot of that.
Well, what about you in dating? Just generally, have you often dated people who are also deaf? Have you often dated people who are hearing?
Well, I've definitely dated a lot of deaf people, but that was really prior to finding my career in the entertainment industry. You know, I was really a part of the deaf community, of course, and I wasn't against dating a hearing person, but it just was a lot easier to date somebody who signed. I mean, I've definitely dated a few hearing people who knew ASL, which makes things easier. But after, you know, finding my place in Los Angeles, you know, 90% of the people who live here are hearing. So, you know, I tend to date around more hearing people, I should say. It does make it a little bit more complicated when they don't know sign language because, you know, dating essentially becomes building a foundation of a language, right? Versus really getting to know someone. So, you know, I feel like it's a little bit of a side, a little bit of a bummer.
Yeah. My little sister is married to a man who, when they met, she was only she spoke some Spanish. She's primarily spoke English, and he spoke a very small bit of English and mostly Spanish. And now their household is a mostly Spanish speaking household, and she's fluent, and his English is very good now too. And I will say that cool. I think that gap is something that, like, you know, you hear about in terms of a romance novel or My Little Sister's Life. But it seems different even than ASL, which I think we don't talk about as much as a language. So English and Spanish, like how sexy, she had to learn Spanish, she had to learn English. But I don't know if we commodify or talk about the difference between.
Definitely. And I think, you know, truly, like, the point of that is culture, right? You know, Spanish, you know, I would say is pretty, you know, broadly known out there. But I think it's also really tied to many different cultures, which is incredible. But not a lot of people are really aware that the deaf community has its own culture, right? I think that's where the big gap comes. Plus, it has to do with, you know, a hearing ability versus a hearing inability. So I think it is definitely hard to kind of compound those two and comparatively with Spanish.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That makes sense. I think what you're saying, I can understand from the perspective of the queer community, which a lot of times I think for a straight person, it's hard to understand that, like, we have our own history, our own role models, our own jargon, our own, like, favorite coffee shop that is explicitly inclusive, you know, that it's not just being outside of straight culture, but that it's also being inside of queer culture. And similarly, straight people don't have to learn about queer shit. Like, I have gone to all the straight movies. I mean, they, you know, now I guess sometimes there might be some straight people at a queer movie, but, like, that's, you know, very fucking new. And I still think that
definitely it's this. I mean, honestly, I was just texting actually a group of all my best friends are all straight guys, and I said, you have to watch The Boys in the Band, right? I mean, I love it. and they're not going to understand so much of it, right? But I think they're really going to try to get it, but that's so much of the gay queer experience, right? Is, you're absolutely right. So I have this show that's, full of gay and queer men, and I'm trying to kind of bring that culture into their world to give them a little bit more exposure. And I think the way that they view the queer community is really as a monolith.
Yeah, absolutely. Or not connected necessarily. Because I also think that we talk so much about division in the queer community, and also people make so much fun of the many letters. But I was just listening to, I was
right.
just, there you go. I was just listening to a podcast that's called Code Switch, and they were talking about the word BIPOC, or like the acronym BIPOC. And it's like a Latinx woman and a Black man, and they're talking about whether or not they like it. And then they were interviewing a bunch of people, sociologists, whatnot. And eventually the sort of thing that they came to is that whether or not people want to identify individually as something different, the collective experience makes us care about each other. So being part of a larger acronym gives us a desire to protect everyone in that group. And I don't know what that experience is like for deaf people. Is there a world where other folks with disability, like that there's a clustering there or a community there?
Definitely. It's definitely interesting to consider. I mean, I'm 31 now, but there was a time when I was 25, right? And the first 25 years of my life, I grew up and I would say, I'm not disabled. I'm not a part of this disability community. It's a completely different world, for me. But, the more I met people and the more I really started to realize, it became my own kind of understanding of my own identity, right? There are different accessibility needs, certainly in the greater, disability category than there might be specifically for deaf and hard of hearing people. But it's really like internalized ableism that I was experiencing forever, and wanting to really kind of disconnect from that ability or from that greater group. Really, I mean, it definitely wasn't contentious by any means, but I needed it reframed for me to understand, that there is this much larger community that can band together and like you said, protect one another and support one another, or at least advocate for one another. In the deaf and hard of hearing community, we certainly have, we're very inclusive, obviously, of all sorts of deaf people, but we have a category that we would consider deaf plus, right? Which would mean deaf with an additional disability. Trying to think of, I think it's DBTHHTHH. I mean, we've got some acronyms as well, which essentially means deaf blind, deaf and hard of hearing. We definitely have the acronyms and which exist in our world in order to, show inclusion of everyone and show that we're kind of a larger collective. Yeah.
Right. I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. I think I can do it. I think I can make this make sense. Something else that yeah, exactly. Get excited. Something else that I am curious about is specifically being a person who has received attention for their physical beauty, and then having something that might make it create a barrier for the hearing community to access you. Because like there's a world where if you're modeling, if you're somebody who's getting a lot of attention for their physical beauty, you're being commodified, you're being objectified. And then there's this thing that sort of puts you in another category that is like, that requires accommodation, that puts the onus on a hearing person to give a shit about something about you. And I guess I just would imagine that maybe that is some confusing messaging because it's superficial.
Well,
attention.
Definitely. I think, definitely as a model, it felt like an easy way out, right? you know, as you know, as somebody who did get a lot of attention for, you know, the physical aspect, which, you know, might have been perfect. I think, you know, my individual disability was really a challenge to people and their depth, right? I mean, modeling for me often felt like show up, watch the flashes, leave, right? But, you know, I was able to change a lot of minds of hearing people who perceived me as, you know, a deaf person, or, you know, just the deaf community in general as this sort of monolith. You know, I'm somebody who now is able to, you know, sell TV shows, right? And produce TV shows. And that, I think, you know, really goes against exactly what they, you know, the hearing community in general would expect of me, which is to stay in the modeling lane, right? You know, it's definitely something that they're not used to. And I think it kind of calls out their own bullshit, right? When they see that and they want to say, well, you should have stayed in the modeling lane. And it's like, why? Because I'm deaf and it was just physical. You know, it was very quick for me to realize that, you know, modeling, while I really enjoyed the impact that I was able to make, was very limiting, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I'm also curious because I know you are, well, I watched the trailer for Deaf You, which is the show that's coming out about Gallaudet.
Yeah.
And then I also know that you have some other shows that you're developing that I think are in the scripted world, right?
I do, yeah. So I also have a feature film coming as well, which is really thrilling. But really, you know, once I found my career here, I realized I'm incredibly lucky and I'm very blessed. But it does come with a burden to shoulder, right? It's, you know, it was a few years of really having to behave myself and be, you know, the good boy that represents the deaf community very well, and I have to be very well behaved. And later I just felt like, you know, I can't be the only one out here doing this work, right? We needed more people. I mean, obviously, I'm happy and I'm very thrilled to do it, right? I'm a deaf person who's a part of the LGBTQ plus greater community, but we need more diversity in Hollywood than just that, right? We need more inclusion than just that and more representation. And Deaf You felt like a real way through that. You know, to go to Gallaudet and to be on campus and to see the beautiful diversity that makes up our world, whether they come from different backgrounds or different regions or different places in the world with different sign languages, you know, different levels of using ASL. I really wanted to show the breadth and the depth of our community and the beauty that is within there, and also stretch the meaning of what it is to be deaf and who falls into that category. And it kind of comes down to like, who can say within our microcosm, right? You know, I mean, we're definitely this, you know, this much smaller subgroup that has our own culture and our own norms and mores. But, you know, I really wanted to show kind of the diversity, and I'm so thrilled to be able to do that. And it feels like I'm able to kind of pass a little bit of the burden to others, and that we can kind of share in that fight.
Right. I also will say, just as a hearing person watching that show, just the trailer for Deaf You, you know, the inclusion of, well, not the inclusion, watching ASL, I don't actually get that much opportunity. You know, it's not, I actually don't have deaf friends. Certainly my interaction is with interpreters. And that's an outward interaction, right? Like they're next to me, not facing me. I'm not interacting with that person. And so I think that just for me, that was something I was struck by, is that it's always helpful to be able to see the thing or to be able to experience the thing, if it's not something that is in your daily life. And I think I'm also curious if are your scripted shows going to include ASL as well? Like if they were to be made?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm leading in one of the scripted shows. And we have several possible deaf rules that we're working in currently. But yeah, our leading language will be American Sign Language. It's similar to like Parasite director, for example, Boon Jong, who in his speech, you know, essentially he said, well, if you can't, you can't, right? And, you know, if that's the measure, right? And we feel the same way. I mean, we would much rather provide this language to the outside world and you know, really give hearing people kind of a glimpse into it, right? I mean, everyone accepts Narcos with just subtitles, right? I mean, they're speaking Spanish and hearing English speakers, you know, are happy with that. So I'm sure they'll be accepting of ASL in the same way. It's a nice challenge to the audience.
Yeah, I actually completely agree. I think we are there, like just in general as a TV watching culture. I think that we're at the place where it's
definitely
exciting Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it took me 31 years of my life of watching TV with captions and never complaining one bit, right? It's like, come on, guys, it's your turn, right? This is a two-way street.
Yeah. Actually, I mean, it's wild just how much stuff I have missed in my own life. I was at a hotel, I think, and when I turned on the TV, it was set to descriptive captioning, which I had never encountered before. And it made me I left it on and I watched, like, for the however many days I was in town doing shows, I left on descriptive captioning, which is for folks who are blind or can't see what's going on screen. They're describing what's going on.
Right.
I will say, yes, right. Anyway, it was I kept watching Law and Order, which first of all is also like a great thing to hear described because terrible things were coming out of this person's mouth who had to describe what was on TV.
Right. Yeah. And, it could be funny in a lot of ways, definitely. There's a lot of humor, I'm sure, in audio description on the TV. It's funny. A lot of my captions I look at and I'm like, the words they use are so bizarre or just, way above what they're really going for. I mean, in fact, there's so much comedy there, right? I mean, hearing people grow up with English and they become proficient over time. So, of course, some of these words get kind of up there, but I'm sure it's a great experience to see that in audio description. I can't imagine the humor.
Well, right. I mean, I think actually more so my experience was realizing how desensitized to violence I was because it was like a person's head is bashed in on screen. And I was like, oh, I just take that for granted. But I will just say that it was a very cool experience.
Right.
And I always watch television with captioning on. I don't know why that is true. I think sometimes I don't want it to be that loud. And so I watch it always that way. And I do think that, like, I think we're ready for any show that you might create that has a lot of I was also thinking about you saying that you use a lot of hand gestures and you grew up in a Sicilian family. That to me would feel actually antithetical. I'm from an Italian household, and I would imagine that maybe Italian culture and ASL would not work well together because there's so much that is provided via gesture.
Definitely. It's like a double whammy.
Yeah, it's opposing forces, for sure.
Yeah. It's great. I think, a lot of people assume that, my family all being deaf, my house is really quiet, but we don't actually realize how much noise we make, right? Because we can't hear a lot of what's going on. So whether it's washing dishes or, closing cupboards or slamming doors, we just, we don't hear kind of, a light close versus a slam, right? We just don't have really any gauge for it. So it's very, very, very loud. Plus you add in the fact that we're all Italian and our hands are always flying. I mean, it scares a lot of hearing people away.
Well, to that point, another thing that is exciting about these shows that you're talking about or the work that you're doing now is that I would imagine it also would be helpful for there to be deaf or hard of hearing folks or people who are fluent in ASL working elsewhere, in the crew, obviously in the writer's room. I just think it's oftentimes if you're not in the entertainment industry, when a new thing is introduced, right, you think about the people that are on camera and not necessarily the people that are behind the scenes. But having had the opportunity to create a show myself, I prioritized hiring queer folks, and that is something that all at all levels, and because I could. And I would also imagine that it would actually benefit, it would benefit the show for there to be people working on it who can communicate well with the stars, with the people who are on camera. And so it's a really great cascading effect where when you're in charge, it's not just that you are in camera, it's not just that you are in the room, but it's also who you might know and the resources that you might be able to provide for other folks who are working in the industry.
Definitely. It's funny that you mentioned that. Shows easily become so much better once you bring in perspective of those with the lived experience, people who can really understand it. That's how you make amazing TV. You hire people who are from that community. I mean, it's as simple as that. My experience growing up, I always watched, TV and movies, and, there were deaf people periodically on screen, but it was always one deaf person in a movie, right? It was always one deaf person in a TV show.
Yeah, it was always
and it
Marley
was
Matlin.
always the same. It was always the same type of deaf person. There was no storyline. There was nothing. It was just, this one kind of trope, right? You would see they would often pan away from the sign language and cut in the middle of a conversation. And so, I would have to read the captions to understand what somebody using my language on TV was saying, because hearing editors didn't understand, like, okay, we've got to wait or find a creative way to reframe how the signing is actually working so that they can finish the sentence, whatever the case may be. So, I mean, there's a lot of humor in that now looking back, but, for Deaf U, that was something that I was really proud to change. We made sure that we hired everyone from the story team to the crew to the talent, everyone at a minimum of 50% deaf people, right? I mean, of course, the goal is 100%, but, we're building from the deaf community and people who have had those lived experiences. And I'm very, very, very proud to say that we, made that show with half the hearing world and half of the deaf world coming together and creating that project. And I'm hoping that, it'll be my little empire someday, but yeah.
Right. Well, I spoke over you for a moment and said, yes, it is always Marley Matlin that is on television. And I think that I just think about her as being so,
right.
First of all, she's amazing, but she's also
right.
long been the example for the entire community. And she is a deaf person who speaks. So also that is its own thing, right? Because if
definitely,
that's the person,
it's a very different experience. Right. Right. And, of course, no intention to say that, that different experience is by some way negative in any way, but everyone has their own, experience within the deaf community. And, we have a really large demographic with a lot of variation to it.
Right.
And, growing up, I went to deaf schools and I had come from a deaf family. Marley Matlin, I believe, she became deaf, I want to say, sometime around 3. Her family is hearing. She went to a mainstream program. So her lived experience is much different than mine, making her, not the representation that I would expect to see of myself on screen, right? But she definitely shows that other slice of the community. And I always say there is no one right way to be deaf, which I think is really important.
Absolutely. Also,
and that's just to add, I mean, that's also why Deaf U is really important for me, because it shows this beautiful diversity from language fluency levels to, whether they came from a deaf school or a hearing program or, their communities, their local hometowns. They all come into Gallaudet University where, some people are from, deaf schools, some people are from mainstream programs, and, they are showing up ready to learn, ready to pick up the language, but everyone has this different story. I remember when I came into Gallaudet, I met another deaf student who didn't know any sign language, had gone through, school and had tried a little bit here and there, but, wasn't really, signing and wasn't really aware of our culture and just thought, well, he'll come to Gallaudet and he'll just pick it up. But, within 4 years, he really had become the embodiment of our culture, and, he was living 10 minutes away from Gallaudet and didn't really know anything about the deaf community or the fact that there was even this large deaf college right up the road just for him. That there was this whole group in this world of people that was just waiting to welcome him. That I would consider pretty sheltered. But I wanted to shine a light on that because it is so important to represent our community. And that is what 95% of deaf kids go through in America, right? I mean, I'm like within the 5 to 10% category of deaf kids who come from deaf families. Most kids have hearing parents and they go to mainstream schools, and I really wanted to show that.
So that person that you said that came to Gallaudet with no sign language, is that outside of the norm? Like the norm is having some or fluency?
Well, I would say that is the norm, to be honest with you. That's what 95% of it is, unfortunately. It's really the largest factor in me creating a foundation. I created my foundation, the Nyle DiMarco Foundation, to provide deaf kids language access from the first day of their birth, because we have a very serious epidemic in this country that, kids arrive to the age of 5 without any language. they're, not able to walk into a kindergarten classroom and, interact with other students, and they're just not ready to learn. They can't express themselves or, talk about feelings or anything. I mean, it's really unfathomable in many ways. I had access to American Sign Language from the day that I opened my eyes, which really shaped my identity. I mean, language gives you the ability to identify who you are. It gives you the ability to understand what you can be and what you're capable of, right? I mean, for me to realize that I'm not straight required language, right? And had I not had access to that early on in my life, I might not have been able to actually understand and shape my identity. It's interesting because often we see deaf kids without language typically find themselves without an identity, right? Which is different than a personality, of course, but they really struggle with their identity much later because they simply don't have the language and the confidence to really explore that. They had gone through so many years of trying essentially to fit this hearing world that was nothing like them. Trying to talk, or no one really offering them any other way to connect with other human beings sets them up as a delay to find out, like, who am I? Like, what can I do? What am I doing? It's really, really interesting.
That is really interesting. I also want to ask, I think because of the way this podcast has specifically gone, you have, first of all, you're so well spoken. Delight to speak to you. It's a delight to have you on the show. And I also will say that
thank you. Appreciate that.
Your interpreter, Gray. Hi, Gray.
Yeah,
I don't even
great.
think I said hi to you. I would imagine that, I work in the same industry that you do, in some ways. I mean, I also have, it turns out I've rarely modeled and often done stand-up comedy. But other than that, a lot of overlap. And one thing that is really, one thing that's really true is, when I walk in a room and I'm trying to sell a show, I'm trying to make myself known, being the center of focus, being able to carry that room is so important. And I don't know what it is like to have an interpreter that is speaking with, anybody that might be in that room. I don't know what that is like to have people direct their attention to someone who isn't you. And I'm curious as to, how that works for you, what that's like emotionally.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say, there's two major approaches. One is to have an interpreter, right, who's in the room with you, right, and always behind the hearing people, right, which I'm always at the front of the room and hearing people are behind, which means they're listening to the voice coming from behind them, but they have no choice but essentially to look at me. And it forces them essentially to look at me, as opposed to having an interpreter side by side, right? I think it really sort of loses the purpose in many ways. Having an interpreter, in front automatically, because of the hearing mindset, people will look at the person speaking, right? And it makes it much tougher to carry the room, as you said. The other approach, which is really my favorite, and is what I do with Gray, is I FaceTime him into a meeting, right? So I put him in front of me on my iPad and I sign, and it's cool because it's just me in the room, right? I don't have to worry about anybody looking at another person.
Oh, right. Of course. I mean, this is a helpful technology to you. This technology that's new to me,
it's much easier,
is a helpful technology to you. Yes. Yeah, because so we're in a Zoom room where my producers are here, but they turn off their cameras. And then Gray is here in my group of people, but I've pinned your video because I did, want to be looking at you because you're who I'm speaking to, but I really do see
that's great.
That,
that's
that this is something
exactly what it's supposed to be like. Yeah.
Right. Oh, wow. Thanks, Zoom. Thanks, Zoom, for already being a great technology for you. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah. It's wonderful. Technology has really made it much easier to be deaf in many ways. Obviously being somebody from a fourth generation family, all of us love being deaf, of course, but it's interesting to see how my parents and grandparents or great grandparents, their experiences has been so different, right? With each generation, there was different technology, right? I mean, for me, going through a world without, access to a phone. I didn't have access to a phone until the Sidekick. Do you remember those? The Sidekick
Yes.
was the best phone ever. I mean, it was phenomenal. But I didn't really have access to a phone. I think I got it when I was a freshman in high school, maybe. And it's fantastic. It was the first phone that you could really text on. And then, my parents didn't have access to a phone all of their lives until they got a TTY machine, which, looked like a typewriter that you would just stick your phone on, and it would, make a call to a specific relay operator. You could call other deaf people or, hearing people. But, my grandparents, they didn't have a TTY, right? They didn't have access to a phone, and they lived in, Brooklyn and Queens. So, they'd have to get on the train, go to a deaf friend's house and, ring their doorbell so that the lights would flash. And if no one was home, they would leave a note, or they'd try the next day, right? Oftentimes we would leave a note that said, hey, I was here. I'm not anymore, but I'll be here tomorrow again at 7, and they'd have to get back on the train and go all the way home. Right. And, the people come home and they're like, oh, we missed them. So now, I can send one text and be like, you home? All right, I'm on my way. It's great.
Wow.
Instead of having to go through all that work. So it's really changed our experience.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's beautiful to be able to do this interview with you. Like, I'm so excited that this worked and that we had a way to do it. I know that so I used to work in special ed before all of this stuff. And I worked with middle schoolers. And so some of them were kids who had cerebral palsy. They were nonverbal, and they were getting their first Dynavox, their first computer that was then gonna create speech for them to be able to interact with the world. And then we would be going on field trips to see if those kids could order their own ice cream at an ice cream store, or something that they had never previously done, because somebody was always speaking for them. And these are kids that also, they're not speaking at ASL. Right. They're generally nonverbal before getting this, because also hand control is not a thing that was accessible or possible for them. And so I do know, just from that experience, some familiarity with what you're talking about, the moment where somebody's able to communicate for themselves. I feel like I can't believe that's something I've seen in my life. But that moment of transition between...
It's very empowering. Very empowering.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful to see.
Yeah. And, it's interesting as well that most technology has been invented by disabled people, specifically for their own empowerment of their own experience. And that typically leads to a more broader use and the public using it the same way that we see in universal design. For example, FaceTime, right? FaceTime, isn't a new concept for deaf people. We were using FaceTime a long time ago. We used to video chat through webcams and what are called video phones. So, but for hearing people, it's very new, right? Captions, same thing. A lot of people love captions, but we were using them before hearing people ever really saw a purpose in that. So, I feel like, people just in general from the disability community really have driven that innovation. Which is great.
Well, thank you to the deaf community, because I would not have survived the pandemic without FaceTime.
Right. Yeah. Seriously.
Nyle, before I send you back into your day, I always have folks shout out a queero, which is a person, place, or thing that made you feel like you can be who you are today. Will you shout out a queero?
Ooh, my queero. That's a good one. Ooh, interesting question. You're putting me in the spot. Let's see. It's funny because, having to choose one, I always talk so much about how, there's no representation of deaf people in Hollywood, but, and having to look up to, it's funny that the focus of this question is more on someone who would be hearing. I would have to say my queero would probably be somebody who's not quite well known, but a very good friend of mine within the deaf community who is incredible and inspires me every day. His name is Tate. He's much like me. He came out much later. And, that was one of my first realizations that maybe I wasn't straight, he had kind of paved the way for me to understand that I could be something more than just deaf. I had always felt that they were really sort of mutually exclusive and that I would have to pick one. But Tate really helped me discover that and kind of stretch the model that I was living in. And I mean, he's not all that well known, but I'd say Tate. It's a tough one.
People do their family members or...
Yeah, I mean, we need more representation, obviously.
Yeah, of course. Well, I think that sometimes, like you're saying, it doesn't have to be the most impactful to the most people. It just has to be the most impactful to you. And that can be a lot of... That can be your buddy. That can be your friend. Because that shit does matter. It's proximity.
Yeah, sometimes. Definitely. And I would say, my other queero probably would be Cello Man, who's a really good friend of mine. If you've heard of Cello Man, I love him so much. I love everything that he is, how he embraces himself and the layers to his identity. And so many times I look at that and I think, wow, I really, the language that he had at 18 years old to really, be able to approach that in a way that, the media could see, was really incredible. So yeah, Tate and Cello.
Yeah. Cella's a super cool person to encounter just through the way I've encountered him, like just the internet. And I will also say that I think that I'm sure that this person has told you that you're impactful, because I also will say that that's another thing that's really wonderful about, for me, meeting people that are in the queer community, is that we get to impact each other. Does that make sense? It's like the person who's the most inspirational for me has often somehow been able to tell me that I'm inspirational to them. I think that's something that's so specific and beautiful about our community, and that works even more the more layers you have in common. Yeah, that's right.
Right. Yeah, you definitely push each other. We're all just walking each other home. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
it's great. It's so important. I mean, the things that are so important to put out there, right? That maybe people don't understand or still, lacking some kind of understanding of and finding their own language to be able to push one another. It helps us mobilize and really function as a community, right? Of a group within our own respective communities. It's wonderful. You're right.
Nyle, it was truly so nice to speak with you.
Yes, definitely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And
your shirt is so cute.
Yeah, I would absolutely love to do this again. Thank you so much. I love this shirt. Actually, I bought this at kind of a random place. It was great.
Cool. Thank you.